Me of the people, the media, really? Only if you've got something to hide do you fear seeing your name in print or your face on TV, or if you possibly cannot manipulate it. Just watch Donald Trump demonizing the press after losing the House of Representatives to the Democrats in the US midterm elections. Take a look.
Honestly, I think you should let me run the country. You run CNN, and if you did it well, your ratings would be much better.
If I may ask one other question, Mr. President. If I may ask one other question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's enough.
Mr. President, I was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am.
Excuse me. That's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other question, if I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have?
I'm not concerned about anything with the Russian investigation because it's a hoax. That's enough. Put down the mic.
Mr. President, are you worried about indictments coming down in this investigation?
Mr. President.
I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them. You are a rude, terrible person. You shouldn't be working for CNN.
And we have our own Donald Trump here when it comes to attacking the media. Look at EFF leader Julius Malema in 2010 when he was ANC Youth League president. He attacked a BBC journalist during a press conference.
If you've got a tendency of undermining blacks even where you work, you are in the wrong place. Yeah, you are in the wrong place. And you can go out. Yeah, you can go out. Rubbish is what you have covered in that trouser. That is rubbish. That which you have covered in this trouser is rubbish. Okay? You are a small boy. You can't do anything.
I didn't come here to be...
Come out. Go out. Go out.
So what's all that about? Here with me is Wits University's Anton Harber and SANEF's Chris Law. And then from Washington, our US correspondent, Simon Marx. I'm going to start off with Simon Marx first. Simon, I mean, everyone's reeling, other than his supporters, with those sort of comments. Donald Trump. What's been the response there? What have people said about it?
Well, I think it's worth making the point, Jane, first of all, that if you think that he behaved in a petulant, grumpy and aggressive fashion yesterday towards the press, you should have heard what he had to say about some of his fellow Republicans who eschewed his offers of assistance to appear alongside them during the midterm elections and then went down to defeat. At one point, he actually read their names off and said that he had no compunction about losing sleep over the fact that they had lost their races. The White House has doubled down now on that completely unprovoked attack against Jim Acosta, and he was only one of at least 3 reporters that came in for that kind of treatment at the hands of the president. They have revoked his pass. He's no longer allowed on White House grounds, and they have released, unbelievably, a doctored videotape that Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House press secretary, a woman who is no stranger to telling lies on the president's behalf, is now using to justify claims that Jim Acosta, the CNN correspondent, manhandled the White House intern who was trying to take the microphone away from him. He did no such thing if you look at the real videotape as opposed to the doctored version of the videotape that the White House has put out. You know, we are now in a completely different reality in this country from where we have traditionally been. There was a great veteran White House correspondent by the name of Sam Donaldson. He used to bedevil Ronald Reagan. He would shout questions at Ronald Reagan all day long. Reagan would often use the rotor blades of the helicopter on the White House lawn to pretend that he couldn't hear Sam Donaldson's questions. But Reagan fundamentally understood that the compact was basic. He had a right, Sam Donaldson, to ask questions, and on numerous occasions Ronald Reagan called on him and then gave him an answer. And Donaldson used to say, there's no such thing as a tough question. It's only the answers that are tough. And that's what Donald Trump was finding yesterday.
And, I mean, obviously, everyone's sort of reeling, as you say, he you know, makes it incredibly personal. But calling the media the enemy of the people there, considering his supporters, what sort of impact has that had on media freedom there and the safety of journalists?
Enormous, and he's used that moniker, the Stalinist moniker, the enemy of the people, to describe CNN and other television networks here that he doesn't like for the past several months, to the point where now opinion polls show that a majority of Republican voters believe that the media is the enemy of the people. And if we break this down, Jane, it's important to understand what Jim Acosta was trying to ask him about yesterday. The question that sparked all of this was a question about why President Trump had lied to the electorate, claiming that a caravan of Latin American immigrants was about to invade the United States days before the election, even though that caravan of immigrants was more than 1,000 miles away from the U.S. border with Mexico. That's a question that Donald Trump doesn't want to answer. And it was President Trump's use of mendacity over that issue during the election campaign that in some parts of the country, particularly in border areas, Texas for one of them, definitely assisted Republican candidates because voters out there bought the idea that the country was about to come under attack when it absolutely wasn't.
All right, thanks for that, Simon Marx. We'll leave it there. Chris Law and Anton Harber. Well, I could see you two shaking your head in disbelief. Anton, what do you think is the impact, the fallout of that kind of rhetoric?
I think that it undermines democracy. I think that it's very important to say clearly that an independent, critical press that can ask tough questions, hold presidents to account, is as fundamental to democracy as the vote. They work together. Democracy, you have to have both of those and, of course, other elements as well. So by attacking and undermining the media per se, it's one thing to criticize the media, it's one thing to criticize elements of the media, but to make sweeping generalizations that undermine the role and the position of the media in a democracy is a threat to democracy.
And if you've got a weakened media or Simon was saying there, many of his supporters believe what Donald Trump is saying. Where does that leave then the clout of journalism?
So I think you'd need a combination of things in order for you to get to that point. And I think that there's been a sustained publication of fake information around so many things. I mean, it started from day one with Trump, right? So his inauguration crowd and all of those kinds of things. And it's you could clearly see that he was very moody and grumpy, and it ultimately what I find very, very concerning, both here and in the States, is that there does seem to be a culture that is developing around what President Trump would call fake news, but it's just something that he doesn't agree with, and that's where that sort of enemy status then comes in with the press. And as you alluded to earlier, we kind of see that with certain political individuals in South Africa as well, where if someone says something or does something that they don't like, they get physical, or they get violent in a non-physical way, which is causing just as much harm and is fomenting this environment that we find ourselves in, where it almost seems that we don't really know top or tail, truth or falsehoods and those kinds of things.
A dangerous place to be. I just want to alert you to this WhatsApp. I'm sure you've seen it. Sunday Times journalist Juanita Hunter was on Twitter exposing an alleged threat by ANC Women's League Secretary General Meokgo Matuba, and this is after she questioned about this plot to unseat President Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, in this tweet, Hunter says she doesn't understand why the Secretary General of the ANC Women's League sent her a picture of a gun after she called her to answer questions, and I hope we can see that on the screen there, but I'm sure it'll pop up at some stage. I mean, you couldn't get more threatening than that, could you? And the fact that you feel that you are in a position where you can respond that way is staggering.
That bullying attitude, we saw it with Trump, and we see elements of it here, a bullying attitude towards the press. Democracy requires an atmosphere in which there can be a free flow of information and an attitude of mutual respect, that you might disagree, but you will listen, you will hear, you will argue, you will debate, you will fight. You might even fight quite aggressively. But it requires a mutual respect that that politicians have a role, that an MP has a role, and the president has a role, and the media has a role, and they depend on each other. And if you don't have or build or support that mutual respect, then you start to eat away at these institutions.
Because actually it's a fantastic relationship when it works, isn't it? Because politicians often talk to the media because they want to get their message across. The media is there to draw out the truth for the public, to be the voice of the voiceless.
Well, you know, Trump needs the media. The media needs Trump. They need each other. So even though Julius Malema may often attack and vilify and denigrate the media he doesn't like, he's a media man through and through. He knows he needs it. But what we have to try and counter is this bullying attitude, that you can try and beat the media into some kind of submission.
And also we saw, you know, the BLF targeting journalists. Do you think that there's a feeling in this country that it's allowed to happen? What sort of protection is there?
Look, I think that in South Africa we do have some good protection for the safety of journalists. You know, many media organizations are very vocal when there is violence against journalists or when journalists are being prevented from doing their job. But, you know, again, the question here is, how did we get to a place of being in an environment where people believe that bullying the media is going to get them anywhere? And one has to, again, look at, for example, Trump's electorate and our very own electorate in South Africa, where, you know, as much as the media and politicians and that can work quite well together, how do we then both serve our audiences and serve our public in that respect? And I think that there's been a real sort of denigration in that sense, where it's not about understanding one another, it's not about being a better society or moving forward, it's about pointing fingers at one another and also about bullying one another, right? And I think, you know, to bring the sort of the online angle in here, how we treat each other online, I think, has got a lot to do with how we treat each other offline in today's
I mean, it's
world.
extraordinary in South Africa when you read the tweets and the sort of the bile that's there. And people feel that they can do that. Is this sort of manipulation evident when it's linked to bullying? I mean, is that what's happening? Is the message being manipulated, or is the protagonist hiding from the truth, or is it a bit of both?
Well, sometimes it's, as we saw with Donald Trump, he didn't want to answer that question, so his response was aggressively undermine the person and try and deflect in that way. But sometimes it's just, I think a lack of respect, a lack of understanding that the relationship between politicians and the media is often a difficult one. But that's how it should be. They should be having a go at each other. One doesn't want it to be over-friendly. They should be having a go at each other, but it's got to be based on a mutual respect for their respective roles.
And it should get everyone to behave a little bit better. We've got a caller from Pretoria, Larry, who wants to talk about journalists' responsibility. Go ahead, Larry.
Hi there. Good evening, Jane, and the panel. Jane, I think one thing that's missing in your discussion, with great respect, and I make the point with great respect, is the fact that there needs to be responsibility, not only from the politicians and other high-level national and global figures like Trump, but also the journalists need to show far more respect and also a greater level of ethics. Because if you look at how, let me take the easy case, Trump. If you look at how Trump was baited, there was nothing said about the U.S. economy having the lowest jobless rate in about 40, 50 years, the achievements of North Korea and all of the other stuff. Now, Trump is not your normal politician, so he says, wild things. But I think what Trump is fighting against and pushing back against is almost a liberal conspiracy in the U.S. media that sort of targets him for everything. By him laughing at the representatives who didn't want to share the platform with him, and they lost.
Okay.
And this guy said no. He was dancing on their grave.
Okay, so
you know what I mean?
Several points there. I mean, journalists do need to behave and make sure that they operate at the highest level.
Absolutely. I mean,
the other point was a bit,
you know, there are obviously, I think sometimes journalists can be quite, you know, they can get people to feel very uncomfortable. But as a president of a country, you can feel as comfortable as you want. You've got to act in a stately manner, right? And maybe what a stately manner with Donald Trump, we don't really know, right? We can talk about the economy and all of those kinds of things, which in my opinion are also somewhat red herrings, because it's a sleight of hand, which is a big part of this, right? So don't look here, look over there, nothing to see here. Another question which he refused to answer, by the way, Donald Trump, was about the Russia probe. And he knew very well at that point that he was going to fire Jeff Sessions, who was the one body standing in the way of him getting direct access to Mueller and thus stopping the probe.
But this is a perfect example of where politicians get angry, because as the journalist, you've got to go for the story that's the hardest-hitting story. You've got to get the top line. And the fact that he's lost the Republicans have lost the House of Representatives, that is the question, isn't it? Where does this leave Trump's future?
And he was trying clearly to deflect the question. You know, the caller is wrong, I think, to say that it's just not true to say there was a conspiracy of the media to paint Trump in a certain way, and some of the media paint him overwhelmingly positively.
He does it himself, doesn't he?
That's right, and he does a lot of that communication himself on Twitter. And how does he come across there? Not as a statesman, but often as a bully. But he is right that journalists have to show a sense of responsibility because they have power. Yeah. But their first responsibility is to ask tough questions, to be persistent, to not let politicians avoid or deflect the questions, and to hold them to account. And one mustn't forget that that is a core responsibility of journalism.
Even though the business model is changing, isn't it, as we segue into social media, greater clout from social media.
But our responsibility is to our people. It is not to a politician or to make a politician look good or bad. And I think that's often, again, in today's society where news is curated by social media platforms and by search engines, people read things that make them think things that aren't exactly real or true. And that is one of my biggest concerns, is that there isn't a sort of foundation to go back to and to say, well, this is how we should be treating each other. Maybe I spoke to you badly. Maybe you spoke to me badly. I mean, courts are a great example. You know, people tear apart in courts, but at the end of the day, they all go and drink a beer together, and they're friends. They're just doing their jobs.
Celebrate the checks and balances.
Exactly, and it's that understanding of each other's roles in our society. And it does feel like by constantly referring to the media as the enemy, the role of media in society, what is it supposed to be? I think another thing that we also have to look at here is rampant corruption has made the media focus so much on that. You know, that we've become this massive checks and balances organization for politicians, which maybe we've always been, or we've always been that, but not to the degree that we are today.
And let's leave it there. Chris Law, we're going to have to leave it there. Anton Harber, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The more the tourists, the more money for South Africa. But do we do Manzi enough? Do we promote it enough? Minister Derek Hanekom chats to me a little later.